The largest protest since Tiananmen Square in 1989.
Video showing protesters in Xinjiang fed up with China's zero COVID rules.
Chinese state media calls the current COVID measures, quote, scientifically effective.
Before November 26, 2022, inspiring a big Chinese protest against a government policy was almost unthinkable. However, the protests in Urumqi, Beijing, Shanghai, Wuhan, and more than 100 Chinese universities showed that people have had enough of the government's strict policies against COVID-19. For 3 years now, China is still experiencing the pandemic as if it were the first day. As a result, large cities and towns are closed at night, and people have lost the freedom to move freely in the streets. The confinement has dramatically affected the government's image, and the continuous blockades have led to citizens facing unprecedented food shortages. These health and economic problems have led the Chinese to take to the streets to demand their rights. After President Xi Jinping stated that the controls would not census until COVID cases were no longer registered, social unrest erupted. According to the BBC, China has partially or totally blocked 552 cities at the prefecture level, affecting more than 280 million inhabitants. Considering that the current population of the United States is 331 million, it would be the equivalent of locking up almost 85% of Americans. Even if the world has already relaxed its anti-COVID measures, Xi Jinping still forces his people to be locked in their homes. Unfortunately, this radical approach has turned his own people against him. The only major city that has avoided a total shutdown is Beijing. Even if things seem to be improving in the capital, a sudden spike in cases led to the closure of some housing estates and shopping malls. To keep the population locked up, Chinese bureaucrats have had to resort to various ruses to make their controversial measures more acceptable. That's why the Chinese government uses phrases like at-home stillness, stasis management, and stop all unnecessary movement. Although some people abided by the rules enthusiastically at the beginning of the pandemic, citizens more loyal to Jinping have begun to suspect confinement is not the solution to battle COVID. Otherwise, the rest of the world would remain locked in their properties. But why has the Chinese government become obsessed with the virus? And why do the authorities continue to maintain such extreme measures? After a few rounds of outbreaks began to spread in March of 2022, local governments started closing highway entrances and exits to contain the virus. They didn't want the 2020 situation to happen again, but unfortunately, things were worse. According to Think China, one driver was trapped for more than 20 days because of a blockade. Another driver was stuck in the middle of the blockade and has been unable to work for 3 months. On April 11, China's State Council issued a circular stating that local authorities were prohibited from blocking or closing highways without authorization and forbade cargo vehicles and their passengers from being arbitrarily restricted. However, the government soon changed its mind and launched a campaign to keep the virus under control. But that decision could lead to the destruction of the country. The zero COVID strategy has seriously affected the Chinese economy. As a result, local businesses have had to make great efforts to survive as if they were in the middle of 2020. As a result, the youth unemployment rate has risen dramatically, and thousands of families cannot make ends meet. Meanwhile, the first festival is on its way. This holiday represents the new year in China's lunar and traditional calendar. Hundreds of thousands of people annually travel to their hometowns to reunite with their families. But this year, the government has refused to allow people to return to their hometowns to celebrate. In fact, the governor of Dencheng County has warned that those who return home with bad intentions will be quarantined and detained, all in the name of saving more lives. But behind the supposed good intentions of the Chinese government, there is a reality we cannot overlook. It has been 3 years since the pandemic began, and they still have not been able to vaccinate most of their people. As of September, only half of the 80-year-olds have received their first vaccination, and less than 20% had a booster. Even vaccination coverage among children was much lower than expected. That is why many regions could not cope with a massive increase in COVID-19 cases. We have as evidence what happened in Hong Kong. When the first wave of Omicron devastated the unvaccinated elderly, the tragedy led to one of the highest mortality rates in the world due to the virus. Nevertheless, China has the world's largest population, over 1,412 billion inhabitants. It would take a massive amount of vaccines to keep all of Chinese citizens vaccinated, not to mention that a single dose is not enough against the virus. Considering the social, economic, and political costs, China's decision to isolate its people is one of the worst decisions ever made. The zero-COVID strategy has brought more negative consequences than benefits. While vaccines are necessary to combat the virus, forcing people to spend 3 years unable to leave their homes is the perfect formula for bringing a nation to ruin, and there is no way e-commerce can remedy the situation. The blockades of cities have led to the surrounding districts being affected. From the coastal region of South China to the north, not a single person has escaped unscathed by this strategy. As a result, thousands of factories, ports, stores, restaurants, and logistics companies have closed their doors because of Xi Jinping's policies. The situation is going from bad to worse, and millions of people could lose their jobs. If there's one thing we can say about China's citizens, it is that they are much less combative than Western citizens. However, there is a limit to how much you can test the people's patience before they demand your resignation. Xi Jinping seems to have crossed this limit weeks ago. As a result, hundreds of people have gathered in front of the local government offices to demand that the government lift the blockades. For months now, protests in China against the strict measures imposed by the government have only increased. Recently, some viral videos on social media show how the Chinese people have come out to march to demand the president's resignation. To make matters worse, the citizens have publicly expressed their anger against Communist Party leaders without fear of retaliation. Citizens marching in the streets clearly show that things have gotten out of control in China. Given that freedom of speech is constantly under attack by the government, only a situation as disastrous as the zero-COVID policies could have caused people to speak against the president. But what was the trigger that started the riots? In November 2022, 10 people were killed in a fire. The tragedy occurred after an electrical failure on the 15th floor of a residential building condemned its residents to death. Sadly, restrictions imposed by the government prevented firefighters from arriving on time. La Vanguardia reports that it took about 3 hours to extinguish the flames before they could rescue 9 injured and extract the bodies of the deceased. This tragedy was the straw that broke the camel's back. Shortly after the fire, thousands of users began to show their outrage on Chinese social networks, such as Weibo. Some of the videos showed a fire truck having to extinguish the flames of the building from a distance. Other users pointed out that the truck could not approach because there were several electric vehicles with dead batteries after weeks of being used because of the confinement. Many internet users have compared it to what happened to the death of 27 people in a bus accident that occurred in September. If it were not for the zero-tolerance policy against COVID, the efforts of rescuers would never have been so complicated. As might be expected, the government acted against these critics in the worst possible way. They removed comments about the fire and arrested a woman for spreading rumors about the number of victims. These actions may not seem like novelty in a country like China, which is subjected to constant repression. Yet, the people had had enough. They were too upset to let the government continue to trample on their rights. After that day, they knew they had to stand up and fight back. 3 years of restrictions and isolation can turn a submissive population into an army of lions. When people cannot earn their livelihood or return to their homes, no government can stand up to the marchers' anger. Following the fire and the ensuing wave of outrage, the Urumqi government announced that the city would gradually restore order to the lives of citizens in low-risk areas. Despite this, the high-risk areas had to remain closed. Even after all the efforts to stop the spread of the virus, COVID cases have not ceased. Therefore, the strategy has not only failed, but has become the reason why Xi Jinping may eventually lose his power. How the fight against COVID has been conducted has turned the entire Chinese society upside down. But why would the government give up? In my opinion, Xi Jinping might be so focused on eradicating the virus because of his eagerness to prove himself as a great leader. Let's put it this way. The COVID-19 crisis started in China. Even after being the first country to present cases of the virus, it is still the only country fighting a fierce battle against COVID, as if the pandemic had just begun. Accepting defeat would mean proving that the government is incapable of dealing with the virus. And that is something that Jinping would never allow to happen. As one of the world's most populous and urbanized countries, China faces greater difficulties and challenges than we can imagine. Fighting a contagious virus in a small country is not the same as fighting it in the world's most populated nation. If the supreme leader were to put a stop to the confinement, he would be proving that his decisions were not right. That is why there is no way he is going to acknowledge his mistakes and accept defeat. Jinping is willing to do whatever it takes to prove that no virus can break him. So he has made his Zero COVID campaign the slogan for his government, and lockups are his biggest weapon. But every time the government announces new restrictions, the president's reputation is heavily damaged. Even the government's supporters have begun to see their leader in a different light after seeing the disaster that confinement has caused. 2022 began with the closing of the tourist hub of Xi'an, home to 13 million people. Then in March, a shutdown was announced in Shanghai that was meant to last less than a week, but it ended up lasting 2 months. Finally, in September 2022, hundreds of thousands of people in 2 cities in Shanghai faced a shutdown even though no cases had been reported. According to the authorities, the aim was to contain the risk from abroad. Nevertheless, the government sought to divert attention from other issues affecting China's millions of citizens. For example, the political reshuffle that shattered decades of succession rules. China's political system works differently than most countries in the world. It has a single-party system. In China, only the Communist Party of China can legally stand for election. Although there is a guarantee of universal suffrage in the constitution, the appointment of the supreme leader is in the hands of his predecessor and the power factions that make up the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. But like any system, some rules must be adhered to ensure the country's functions. Before 2018, China had a 2-term limit per president. However, since the late reformer Deng Xiaoping established the current succession system in the early 1990s, no man has been in power more than twice. Another important thing is that no one over 68 had been appointed as a member of the Standing Committee, and no one under the age of 67 has retired in recent decades. But in October 2022, Jinping began a historic 3rd term that broke all the established rules. First, he had the limit on presidencies removed to remain in power. His next goal was to remove the age limit. Interestingly, his 2 former colleagues retired early. Premier Li Keqiang and former political advisor Wang Yang, both aged 67. Neither of them was close to the supreme leader. By assuming power at 69, he proved again why he was the most powerful man in China. First, he created a fictitious enemy and diverted public attention to eliminating his main rivals. Then, while the people were too busy with the COVID restrictions, he consolidated his position and removed all obstacles on his way to his 3rd presidency. That's why some experts point out that there is no coincidence that the blockades began to spread as Congress approached. For Chinese development professor William Hust, COVID has become a political issue. Jinping had a big mission in mind. He wanted to prove he had the situation under control, heading into the biggest political event of the decade. If he had failed to do this, he would have never been able to present himself as the best option for China. Even if the confinement brought the contagion cases down drastically, experts doubt how long the government will be able to keep up this charade. Sooner or later, people will have to return to their jobs, which is when the virus will spread again. For economists, China could be in for a big surprise after opening its doors to a disastrous economic situation. If most countries have had trouble withstanding 1 or 2 years of isolation, extending this torture for a third year could leave the Asian leader facing crisis from which it will not be easy to escape. Despite government assurances that they are trying to save lives, some people have serious doubts about this. If China's real focus was on saving the lives of its citizens, it would have taken a more vigorous approach to vaccinating the population and bringing in more vaccines from abroad. Yet, we have evidence that domestic vaccines have not been as effective as the government had hoped. Thus, many of the people Beijing claims to be trying to protect with its zero-COVID policy are dead, and new victims may be added to the statistics in the coming months. The idea of having a stable China sounded amazing in theory, but in practice, it has made Jinping a victim of his own strategy. Mass tests, strict blockades, and travel restrictions have kept China's hospitals from collapsing, but they have not stopped thousands of people from taking to the streets to demand that the president resign. A few weeks ago, hundreds of people rallied to demand the president's resignation. Even at Beijing's prestigious Tsinghua University, about 300 students demonstrated against the confinements. After that, Universal Beijing and Xi'an, Wuhan, and Guangzhou campuses joined. But as with most protests, violence and reputation soon followed. When people came out to demand that the president step down, police cracked down on the protesters and ordered them to disperse. Still, the most disturbing situation did not occur until after the protests. Then, according to the testimony of one protester, Beijing police contacted her and her friends to ask if they had attended the rally. They questioned her when she went, how many people were there, and how she had heard about the call. The police insisted that the protest was an illegal assembly and that if he had any complaints, he would file them through the regular channels. In addition, they were quick to remind her not to attend future events. On the other hand, one of her friends, who refused to pick up the phone, was met by a police officer outside her home. According to BBC, Chinese police beat journalist Ed Lawrence in Shanghai and detained him for several hours while he was covering one of the demonstrations. According to the Chinese government, Lawrence had not presented his press credentials. But even if this had been the case, the violence used by the officers is not justified. Images shared on social media show police officers grabbing Lawrence, pinning him to the ground, and punching and kicking him before taking him away in handcuffs. And if a journalist from a foreign media was attacked for doing their job, you can get the idea of how they might have behaved against the protesters. Unfortunately, censorship in China is not only limited to protesters and journalists. Everyone must follow the regime's rules to avoid punishment. As a result, China today has the most censored internet in the world. The government monitors every text message, audio, and social media posts. And nowadays, the Chinese censorship is not limited to social media. The government maintains censorship over all media capable of influencing people's opinions, from print media, television, and radio to cinema, video games, and literature. Everything is monitored by the government. Therefore, Freedom House believes Beijing has the most oppressive and least free network globally. The constant violations of internet freedom show that the government is willing to do anything to stay in power. This ambition to rule China forever has turned the zero-COVID policy into a vicious cycle designed to keep its citizens locked in their homes. Without any resistance, the government can do whatever it wants for the Chinese people, from arresting people to ignoring laws and undermining democracy. But as the president celebrates his third re-election, resistance has begun to show up. If more people start to take to the streets and stand up to the government, we may be looking at the beginning of the end for Xi Jinping's run. But what do you think? Is Xi Jinping done as president, or will he manage to stay in power forever? I'll read about it in the comments. Before you leave, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and click on the next video to learn how leaving the EU has ruined the UK. See you soon.